We're ready to start Numbers chapter 9 tonight. We've studied chapters 9 and 10, and going to talk a little bit, study a little bit, I guess, about the observance of the second Passover. And of course, kind of talked a little bit, I guess, Sunday night about that. When did the observance of the first Passover take place? Yeah, somebody was listening, I guess. The night before they left Egypt, right? That was the first time that they observed the Passover feast. We're going to read about a year later, the children of Israel doing it for the second time, and then talk about how God guided the children of Israel toward the promised land, and then also talk about, the fact that they had an order in which they were supposed to proceed with everything. Question number one, I got mixed up on my questions. A lot of times when I do these sheets, I do them two at a time. So this question number one is actually the question for next week. So I'm going to change it on you just a little bit. If you filled that out already, I apologize. But instead of asking the question, do you find it difficult to be around people who complain a lot, let's ask, do you find directions or guidance important or helpful? Okay, depends on whether you can decipher the directions or not, right? You ever buy something like Dennis is talking about, and I don't know, maybe it was made in another country, and you start reading the directions, and the English is so broken you can't even really follow what you're supposed to do with it? Well, that wouldn't be very helpful in those situations. When would directions be the most helpful? All right, if you're lost, yeah, that would certainly help. How about if you're going somewhere you've never been before? Yeah, that's kind of along the same lines there. What if you're trying to do something you've never done before? You find directions helpful in those instances? Yeah, and that's really, when we talk about the children of Israel, we're studying about them, God was guiding them to the promised land, and he was giving them directions, he was giving them instructions along the way, and of course they were doing something they'd never done before, and they were going somewhere to live, at least, that they'd never been before. Okay, so let's go over to chapter 9 here, and again we're not going to read all this. We have 2 chapters again tonight, no way that we can read all of it and I think discuss it, but it introduces in the first 5 verses the observance of that second Passover. Like I said, it's been a year since the children of Israel have left out of the land of Egypt. During that time, what did they do?
They stayed at the wilderness of Sinai from the time they left.
Yeah, they eventually made it to Mount Sinai, didn't they? And that's where they camped for a pretty long period of time. What important event took place during that time? Well, several important events, I guess.
We got the law.
Yeah, okay, we have the giving of the law. Yeah, and the building of the tabernacle. So that's kind of occupied their time, hasn't it? The construction of that tabernacle, getting everything ready. Now they have it all ready. It's all built. They're ready to go. And so we're going to read about, actually, them, chapter 10, beginning their journey toward the promised land. But unfortunately, there were some people who were not able to observe this Passover. Let's read about them. Somebody read verses 6 through 8 for us there in chapter 9.
There were certain men who were defiled by the dead body of a man, that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And those men said unto him, We are defiled by the dead body of a man, wherefore we are kept back, that we may not offer an offering of the Lord in this appointed season among the children of Israel. And Moses said unto them, Stand still, and I will hear what the Lord will command concerning you.
Okay, so why were these people we just read about not able to celebrate the Passover with the rest of Israel? Yeah, they touched a dead body, and that made them unclean, didn't it? At least ceremonially unclean. And so their question was, what are we supposed to do? Here we are, God gave this important commandment, obviously, But here we are, you know, he's also said if you're unclean, you can't enter into the tabernacle, you can't do certain things, you know, you got to keep your distance from everybody else. And so what is the Lord's will in this particular instance? Now, you have to understand, and I want to point out a couple of things before we talk very deeply, I guess, about this particular idea. But when somebody died, what do you have to do?
Prepare the body.
You had to bury him, didn't you? I mean, you couldn't just sit around and say, well, we'll do it the next day, or 3 days from now, or 4 days from now. You had to take care of that. And we want to point out, they didn't miss this Passover because they've done something wrong. They hadn't violated any laws. They just probably buried those who were dead. In fact, some people believe it might be a reference to the 2 sons of Aaron who had buried their brothers. Remember, as they're mentioned there, or maybe the people that were associated with that death. There were 2 to 4 million people. So I imagine there was more than just, this little small handful that we're reading about here that were ceremonially unclean from touching a body. But they hadn't broken any law of God. They hadn't violated any commandment. The circumstances that had transpired, they were beyond their control. We don't have any control over death. There's nothing in our power that we can do to prevent somebody from dying. And so it was beyond their control, and really the circumstances that were existing was something that was, abnormal. It was an unavoidable circumstance. And so God gives a response to what these people should do. Somebody read verses 9 through 14 for us here, Numbers 9. Yes, sir.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If any man of you or of your posterity shall be unclean by reason of a dead body, or be in a journey afar off, yet he shall keep the Passover unto the Lord. The 14th day of the 2nd month, at evening, they shall keep it and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break any bone of it. According to all the ordinances of the Passover, they shall keep it. But the man that is clean and is not in a journey, and forbeareth to keep the Passover, even the same soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he brought not the offering for the Lord in his appointed season. That man shall bear his sin. And if a stranger shall sojourn among you, and will keep the Passover unto the Lord, according to the ordinance of the Passover, and according to the manner thereof, so shall he do. Ye shall have one ordinance, both for the stranger and for him that was born in the land.
Okay, so how does God respond to Moses' pleading, or I guess asking him what should be done in this situation?
Keep it the next month.
Yeah, they couldn't keep it unclean, could they? Because that would have violated part of God's law. And so what God said is you wait a month. And then in the 2nd month, on the same day, you do exactly the same thing. Every other rule and regulation was still in effect as far as the Passover. But evidently, I guess we could say, God saw this as something that was so important, that he saw fit that people needed to do it. And so he gave, I guess we could say he added some supplemental rules or regulations to the original law itself. Now, what did he say? This, of course, again, want to emphasize, it wasn't because a person had done something wrong that they couldn't keep it. It wasn't the committing of sin that had taken place. It was, circumstances that were beyond their control and really unavoidable. So when you think about that, God talks a little bit, or he mentions there in verse 13, he distinguishes between the person who is clean and the person who's not, on emergency, had to leave on an emergency or something like that, and so he's gone on a journey and can't do what God has commanded him to do. And so he's able, and he just doesn't want to keep the Passover, so he doesn't do it. What was supposed to happen to him? Yeah, he was supposed to be cut off from the people, and that's one of them statements that there's a lot of disagreement on us, whether that's talking about death or just, cut off from the fellowship of the children of Israel. But at any rate, there was punishment that was to be inflicted upon him. And so, not to keep the Passover because a person was just indifferent about keeping it, God didn't tolerate that or make any exceptions for that in any way. It wasn't the case, too, that I think a person could, in their mind say, well, I don't really want to keep the Passover tomorrow. There's a dead body. I'm just going to touch that, Do you think God would have made an exception in that case? Said, well, that's all right. No, it's not the same principle, is it? And so we have to think about, I think the example or the idea is, sometimes we're excused from keeping commandments of God in unavoidable circumstances. So in your minds, what do you think that would be? What do you think a good example of that would be today?
Illness.
Okay, let's just say assembling on the first day of the week, right? We have the commandment from God, we're supposed to do that. But what happens if I'm ill? Does God expect me to keep that commandment?
Expects you to use good judgment.
Yeah, well, you're in another case where there's something that's happened beyond your control. There's no way you could have avoided it. Well, I don't know about that, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to point out here. It's circumstances that were beyond our control. And so in that case, God made an exception for these people. And I think you have those same situations in the church today. Now, does God just say, well, it's all right if you don't want to come? Somebody said, well, I don't really want to worship God on the first day of the week. Or what if somebody said, well, I could go to my boss and ask him if I could work Sunday, and I didn't really want to go to church anyway. I can make money instead of having to go worship God. Well, you think God would make an exception in that case? No. There's a clear difference between, the circumstances, and God differentiates between the two. So, in a case where it was unavoidable, there were supplemental regulations and rules that were added to this law of God. I think we need to keep that in mind, because sometimes, when people, maybe they're a little bit too zealous of the letter of the law and don't think about things like this, but certainly there were exceptions that we can read about within the Bible. So anybody have any thoughts or questions on that idea, comments? All right, let's go to verse 15. Remember, whenever the tabernacle was set up, we're actually going to start talking about the way that God guided and directed his people. But whenever the tabernacle was set up, we read about something happening. Let's read verse 15 here.
And on the day that the tabernacle was reared up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, namely the tent of the testimony. And at eve there was upon the tabernacle, as it were, the appearance of fire until the morning.
Okay, so what was it that covered the tabernacle whenever it was set up? Do you remember? Yeah, the cloud. And was it just, this surrounding cloud that passed by that came down and covered it? Which cloud was this?
Well, it says it has an appearance of fire. I don't know if that would be exactly what, but it was something different.
Yeah, it was the same cloud that we read about. Remember, I think Sunday again. I think I mentioned that in our Sunday morning sermon. But when Israel left out of Egypt, they left by night. And the way that they left is God guided. And the way that he guided them was the fiery pillar, the cloudy pillar that we read about that's guiding them throughout the Old Testament. The first appearance of it there is in Exodus 18 as they leave the land of Exodus. Well, leads them all the way, remember, to Mount Sinai. You have the cloud that comes down on the mountain. And it's basically, that cloud was designed to guide them, whether morning or night, whichever or whatever time of day God told them to move. It was designed to guide them and take them and direct them wherever God wanted them to go. Now, God's original intention wasn't for it to last over 40 years, but it ended up doing that, didn't it? Because of the disobedience of the children of Israel. So that tabernacle, whenever the tabernacle is set up, you always have this cloud that comes over it, and it resides there, again, indicating the presence of God. During the day, it looks like a cloud. Question number 5 here. What did that cloud look like at night? Look at verse 16. Don't have to read it, but yeah, it looked like fire at night, right? So it carried the appearance of fire at night. During the day, it carried an appearance of a cloud. And let's read a little bit about how this cloud and this fire guided them. Somebody read verses, let's read a section here. Somebody read verses 17 through 22 here in Numbers 9.
When the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, and after that the children of Israel journeyed. And in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel pitched their tents. At the commandment of the Lord, the children of Israel journeyed, and at the commandment of the Lord they pitched as long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle, they rested in their tents. And when the cloud tarried long upon the tabernacle many days, then the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and journeyed not. And so it was when the cloud was a few days upon the tabernacle, according to the commandment of the Lord, they abode in their tents, and according to the commandment of the Lord they journeyed. And so it was when the cloud abode from even unto the morning, and that the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they journeyed. Whether it was by day or by night that the cloud was taken up, they journeyed. Or whether it were 2 days, or a month, or a year, that the cloud tarried upon the tabernacle, remaining thereon, the children of Israel abode in their tents, and journeyed not, but when it was taken up, they journeyed.
Okay, so again, you have this principle of God providing guidance for the children of Israel in the form of this cloudy pillar, and at night, the appearance of fire. And so, question number 6 here on your handout: what did the Israelites do when the cloud lifted up above the tabernacle or the tent? Yeah. So think about it again. They're living out here in the wilderness. Obviously, they don't have permanent homes. You know, everybody's going to be traveling in a movable structure. But every time that cloud lifted up, you packed everything up. You folded your tent up, you packed your camp up, and you got ready to move. And so that was kind of the signal when that cloud lifted up. It's time to break camp. It's time to get ready to go. Number 7, what happened when the cloud stayed over the tabernacle? That was a sign. It's time to put up your tent, right? It's time to set up camp. And as long as that cloud stayed there, they camped there. And so that was kind of the way that God moved them and directed them wherever he wanted them to go. Question 8. So what occurred when the tabernacle was over the or when the cloud was over the tabernacle for a few days? Yeah, they stayed in the camp, right? So you read about, in the last verse there, verse 22. Sometimes it was 2 days, sometimes it was a month, sometimes it was a year. So whatever that cloud told them what to do. And so whatever that cloud did based upon the actions of that cloud or the appearance of that cloud, the children of Israel reacted to it properly. And what time of day or night were they supposed to be ready to set out? Verse 21 there. Every time, right? Any time, day or night, they were supposed to be ready. Whenever that pillar moved, they were supposed to pack everything up, and they were supposed to move along with it. And so you have this principle, and again, we're looking at it with already the knowledge in mind that the children of Israel rebelled against God's commandments, and so for 40 years, this is the way that everything functions and transpires. But God guided his people. It wasn't like God was with them just every once in a while. But God guided them every step of every day. I mean, every minute of every day, they could look out there and see, well, here's God. You know, He's with us, so we need to stay here. Well, God's moving, so we need to get up and we need to go over there. And so they had to be willing to follow, didn't they? And to their credit, they were. The Bible says they were tremendous in doing that. Whether it was day, whether it was night, whether it was days or months or years, you know, they did whatever the cloud indicated to them to do. And so let's think about this. What were some of the advantages of following that cloud?
You didn't have to decide for yourself where to go. It directed you. And if I'm not mistaken, didn't last week, didn't we assign somebody to count how many times or come with some kind of figure? I won't mention any names, but you know, how many times the tabernacle was set up and taken down?
I think we did. I wasn't going to put him on the spot, but
Oh, I don't know.
I'm ready. I did the study tomorrow, watching Gunsmoke reruns.
you read Numbers 33, I guess.
Numbers 33.
There you go.
And according to Adam Clark, there's 42 encampments from the time they leave Egypt, I mean from the city they left, to the edge of the Jordan River. It took about, 7 or 8 prior to getting to out for a wilderness of Sinai.
Yeah.
Where they build the tabernacle. And so it's after that, there's 33 or 32 or 33 times that they have to pack it up and move it till they get into the question that I have. Is that where Pentecost came from? About 50 days from the time they left till they get outside. Is that where Pentecost comes from? Feast of Weeks.
I don't know.
It's about 50 days.
Yeah, I do know that, but I don't know if that's the reasoning behind it, that God gave it, but that was the number at least that He assigned to it.
But anyway, there you go. Good job.
He delivered, didn't he? You know what that means. Anytime we have a question, we know who to ask. So, thank you, Dennis. But they, like I said, during that time period, that's one thing that they did faithfully. I mean, they followed that cloud. And, you know, I think about, well, you know, where were they? They were out here in the wilderness, weren't they? I mean, you think they knew every nook and cranny of the wilderness? Think they traveled through there a lot before and camped there? They've been in Egypt for 400 years, so they really hadn't been outside of Egypt for a long time. Probably a lot of these people, or most of these people, were seeing it for the first time. And so I guess one of the advantages we could say of following that cloud was you avoid getting lost, right? As long as you followed that cloud, you know, you were following God, and so you didn't have to worry about getting lost. Another thing to think about is, you know, as long as they followed the cloud, they were safe, weren't they? They decided, well, we'll go off here, we'll do this, or we'll do that. Certainly would have had to worry about maybe being attacked by somebody else, maybe getting lost, maybe running out of water. You know, a lot of things to think about. But that's the way that God chose to guide and direct His people. And of course, does God guide and direct us today? How? Yeah, through the instructions that He's given us. And so just like He provided instructions for them every hour of every day, we have the same blessings today. All right, let's go over to chapter 10 here, and we're going to read about another way that God basically gave instructions to His people outside the cloudy pillar and the fiery pillar. Somebody read, let's see, how many verses do we want to read here? Somebody just go ahead and read chapter 10, verses 1 through 10 for us.
The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Make thee 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shalt thou make them, that thou mayest use them for the calling of the assembly, and for the journeying of the camps. And when they shall blow with them, all the assemblies shall assemble themselves to thee at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And if they blow but with one trumpet, then the princes, which are heads of thousands of Israel, shall gather
Okay, so what does, question 11 here in your handout, what does God tell Moses to make? Yeah, 2 trumpets out of silver. And basically these 2 trumpets were used for, I guess we could say they were used for 2 main purposes. What were those main purposes?
Gathering and alarm.
Yeah, the first one was whenever an assembly was to be called, those trumpets were used to call that assembly. Now remember, we're not talking about 100 people here that Moses could just go out and say, hey, everybody get over here, we need a meeting. We're talking about, remember, over 600,000 men who were 20 years old and upward who were able to fight. So, I don't know, 2 to 4 million people. So you're going to need some kind of system to notify people of what's going on. And so God chose the construction of these trumpets, first of all to call an assembly, and then secondly to kind of give marching orders, I guess you could say, when people were supposed to move and go out. And I think it's pretty obvious the 2 different trumpets had to have 2 different tones, didn't they? I mean, they had to sound different from one another because they could tell when both trumpets were sounded. So if they sounded the same, I don't know how you could tell when both trumpets were sounded. So evidently, they probably had 2 different tones to them. So a person could listen to the sound and he could say, well, that's both trumpets, that are being blown. But depending upon whether one trumpet was blown or 2 trumpets were blown, that kind of indicated certain things that they were supposed to do. And then the kind of sound that was made, or maybe we should say the length of the blowing on the trumpet. One indicated an alarm, another one indicated the idea, well, it's time to gather together. And then you also have the number of blasts that would have differentiated in some of these things. So question number 12 here says, what happened when both trumpets were sounded? What did that mean? Yeah, who was supposed to assemble? Yeah, everyone, all of the children of Israel. So at times, it was necessary, and where were they supposed to assemble? At the door of the tabernacle. So there were times, obviously, when God wanted to give instructions to everybody. Those 2 trumpets would have been blown, indicating for everybody to come. Everybody knew, well, we've got to gather together there at the door of the tabernacle. And so it would have created an atmosphere in which, God could easily instruct the people in what he wanted done or make known to him them their will. It's also interesting to point out, did these trumpets call them? When you heard the trumpet, could you just go wherever you wanted to go? No, it called them all into one place, didn't it? And it called them all together. So what happened, or question 13 here, what happened if only one trumpet was sounded? Who was supposed to assemble then? That was the marching order.
Princes of the thousands of each individual.
Yeah, if you look in verse 4, it says, if they blow only one, then the leaders, the heads of the divisions of Israel, shall gather to you. So if both trumpets were blown, it meant all of Israel was to come. If only one trumpet was blown, then it meant only the leaders of the tribes of the children of Israel were supposed to assemble. And then you have question 14. I think when you read about, this idea, I forgot how the New King James Version words the difference. What does the King James Version say about the different sounds, the blowing?
Sound the advance.
Okay. Sound the advance, sound the alarm. I was thinking there was one verse in there. Give me just a second here.
It says the east side would go.
Well, anyway, I can't find it right offhand, but I think what the indication is sometimes the alarm was one long continuous sound, and then you had the blowing. I think some versions may have translated it blasting, And it's the idea of, powerful and long in length. And then you have other times where it says to blow, which I think would have been shortened versions or shortened sounds rather than one long continuous, just, a short sound over and over and over again. So there was a little bit of difference, in the length of the tones, and that indicated what they were supposed to do too. And question 14 there, it says, what happens when the trumpets were blasted? Well, that was the signal to march, like Chase was talking about there. The first one was at the east side, I think, that went first. And then the next time that the trumpet blew, it was the south, I think, that was supposed to go after them. So it indicated to them when they were supposed to march. And then we also, question 15, Moses was supposed to gather the assembly. He was supposed to blow, not blast. That's I think the short signals that we're talking about here. That wasn't the only time, though, that these trumpets were supposed to be blown. We read in verse 9, they were also supposed to be blown at the time when Israel was going out to fight their enemies. And what did God say would happen there?
You should be saved from your enemies.
Yeah, so it was, kind of this idea, by blowing this alarm, blowing this long blast when they went out to fight these wars, it was kind of this idea that it was a signal to God. We're going out to fight. Take notice of us. Come down here and fight our battles for us. And so God says when you go out and you fight these battles, blow on that trumpet. And then we also read it was used during times of worship, wasn't it? That's no secret in the Old Testament. Instruments of music were used in worship to God. This is one of those occasions that we read about. But why were they used during worship? What was the purpose of them? Look at verse 10 there.
Day of your gladness. Is that what you're asking?
A memorial.
Yeah, it was a reminder. That's what that means, a memorial. It was a reminder between them and God that the Lord was their God. And so, during these times, he mentions here these appointed feasts, or sometimes at the beginning of the months, during burnt offerings, during peace sacrifices. You think the Israelites ever kind of lulled to sleep during these times? Think about it today. If while we're going, right here in the middle of the service, if somebody stands up and blows a trumpet really loud.
Or ring the bell.
yeah, or rings the bell like Laney's going to do on this. You think that'd kind of bring your mind back if you were wandering? Kind of remind yourself, hey, what am I doing here? I've got a covenant between me and God. I'm supposed to be worshiping God. My mind's supposed to be focused on this. And so the trumpets were used to help keep their attention on God too. You read about the Ark of the Covenant, leading the march. It kind of became a symbol of God's presence, leading them wherever they went, whatever they did. And Moses had a saying every time when the ark was picked up and whenever it was set down. And it basically relayed to the children of Israel the idea that, God always put God first. God is in charge, let him lead us. As long as we do that, we'll be fine. Had Israel followed that lesson, they would have saved themselves 40 years of misery, but they unfortunately did not. So, anybody have any thoughts or comments, anything before we end tonight?